Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. So this is the Achieve Unified Device Management with Microsoft Intune webinar. So today I'll be talking to you about some of the challenges organizations face in an evolving technology landscape and how some features within Microsoft Intune can help you mitigate those challenges effectively. I'm going to be touching on device configuration profiles, compliance policies, security baselines, and a new feature recently added to the Intune suite, endpoint privilege management. So I know this one cropped up. We had a few attendees ask if this was going to be covered, so I've put together a little demo just to show you as we progress on through. Just before we get to that demo, I do have a few slides that I'll run through, really just to set the scene. Before we jump into the real tenant and a real device, and I'll demo some of the capability that we talk about. If we have any time left at the end of the webinar, I'll open up the floor to the Q&A, but if not, don't worry, we'll capture the questions that get posted. You should be able to post them. In fact, there's a screenshot on the next page, which I'll show you, but you can post your questions into the questions box. If we have time to circle around to those at the end, we'll cover those. If not, we will follow up with you shortly after the webinar. So just a brief introduction on myself. My name's Tom Waller. I'm an architect at Cocho, and I work in the secure digital transformation practice. So really my role as an architect is around helping our clients understand the art of the possible within the Microsoft 365 stack. My focus area is predominantly device management and security, though it's a pretty broad subject matter, as you can imagine. And we as a practice cover pretty much the end-to-end Microsoft 365 stack. But as you can imagine, of late, we've been involved heavily with lots of on-prem device management to modern management migrations, which kind of covers the topic we're talking about today. So really keen to demo some of this functionality to you today. So at Cocho, we spend a lot of time with our clients trying to understand their technology pain points and what keeps them up at night, really. And I think this slide is a great representation of those discussions. Remote workers in a hybrid world, coupled with the sheer number of device types available, are front and foremost of these conversations, as you could imagine. Organizations are struggling with remote endpoint management and compliance. And a typical concern we hear pretty much all the time actually is how can we keep our endpoints compliant when they lose connectivity to our on-prem corporate network. This is something that was really evident sort of during the pandemic. I mean, a lot of organizations unfortunately just lost visibility of their clients, their endpoints, once they were shipped off-site to work remotely. If you're in a good spot, you had a VPN that would support the increased load. But generally speaking, it was a struggle, and one we hope not to have to repeat in the near future. We also discussed the need for a single solution that supports all endpoint types that organizations use today, and not just to focus on Windows. We need support for things like iOS, Android, mobile operating systems for hybrid workers on tablets, phones, but also Mac OS and Linux kind of more often than not now coming into the mix. Managing administrative access often becomes a challenge in this scenario too. So where privilege management tools or current privilege management tools require line of sight to a hosted service or some sort of connection back to the on-premises estate, the last thing we want to do is find ourselves in a situation where we have to give every user local admin rights again, just to allow them to be able to do their job. So that's something that's really come full circle again, and we're starting to have that standard user versus admin conversation again. More now really than ever, users are looking to self-serve as well where possible, so without having to go through support channels to get what they need. And this is something that we've all been familiar with on personal devices for years, being able to use an app store, provision your own applications, and self-serve. But it's slowly making inroads as well inside the corporate world. So we're seeing more and more organizations look to embrace kind of that self-service type approach. which, it's a big change in culture, but one that can really help drive, significant employee satisfaction. And finally, cybersecurity. How do we mitigate risks across each of these pillars when, not only is the landscape so diverse, but the goalposts, they keep moving as well. So, real challenges that we hear from our clients on a day-to-day basis. So Microsoft are continuing to make investments in hardware, software, applications and services to deliver on the promise of delivering more intelligence, more security, and a less costly work environment, as the setting is changing from a all in the office type model to a hybrid model for many organizations. So I have a slide here that kind of outlines what some of that changing technology perspective looks like. So let's have a look at that. So technology needs are evolving really in the modern workplace, but in reality, we're also kind of still living in a world of classic or traditional IT, and there's real tension here. So IT departments have built themselves around the traditional PC lifecycle, managing operating system images, gold images, selectively controlling updates and patching, locking down behavior, but ultimately protecting their users, as best they knew how. And so the reality is really that IT is evolving and adapting. Now, we have this conversation a lot with our clients, as you can imagine, at CodeShow, and really we don't think this should be an either or. CodeShow's approach is to allow you to do both and to modernize at your own pace, to manage risk or your risk in a smart way. So to take advantage of cloud and modern IT, but also to give you the tools and capabilities to bring that design point to your existing investments, so you aren't throwing everything out and starting fresh. We all know best case scenario is, if we could start fresh and build it up from the ground up, we would be modern management and ditch the traditional management tools. But every organization we speak to, we're so far invested in that traditional estate that we need to plan that migration or that modern management approach effectively. New scenarios are playing out right now, such as BYOD, bring your own device, and IoT, Internet of Things. So some of these you'll probably be familiar with. You may even have some experience with inside your organization. But what we're seeing is this need for a unified management tool to bring all of these scenarios under control. And that's where Microsoft Intune comes into play. So Intune is all about doing more with less, maximizing the impact of Microsoft 365 and Intune solutions, while simplifying licensing, management, and vendor landscapes. Intune can help eliminate redundant solutions. So consolidating to a single vendor, it can help cascade cost savings throughout your organization. With Intune specifically, it includes many of the capabilities for which you might already be paying other vendors for. It can also help reduce management costs by simplifying IT management. So when you have one integrated solution, you can optimize your IT admin time. And a simplified IT environment with Intune speeds up traditionally labor-intensive tasks and frees up previously assigned IT and security admin time. And that can be used to transition to higher value activities. Intune can also help protect your digital workers, and Intune helps organizations every day enhance their security stack, realizing cost savings from having lesser security breaches and improved identity and visibility, further establishing a foundation for your zero trust strategy. So Intune really is that single pane of glass, unified management platform that can help you take control and gain visibility of your entire endpoint estate. If you've ever been to one of my sessions in the past, you'll recognize this slide. This is the endpoint lifecycle that we talk about in endpoint management discussions. Now, we break this down into 4 phases, which we think really accurately describe that lifecycle, and they are enroll, configure, protect, and support and retire. So when we talk about enroll, that's all about getting your devices managed in some way within Intune. So this is where we talk about different methods for enrollment, across the various operating systems, where we look to provide management capability to BYOD devices, for instance, around app protection policies, and where we start talking about zero-touch enrollment, typically with functions like autopilot. Configure is about deploying the actual configuration to a device. So in this context, we're talking about device configuration profiles, applications, connection profiles, for instance. Protect is around deploying device restriction and protection policies, application and identity protection policies to help protect corporate data, and protecting devices from threats with MTD, so Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, as a mobile threat defense tool. We actually also talk here now about endpoint privilege management, which is, as I mentioned earlier, a really new feature. Keen to show you that in a moment. I think it has some real value in the Intune suite. And finally, support. Support and retire is about supporting users with their managed devices, but also about how we offboard devices from the solution. Let's say a user leaves the company, or a device is lost or stolen. We need to be able to act on that scenario effectively. What we don't want is our corporate data or credentials to be out there in the hands of someone that shouldn't have them. Typically, I talk through each of these phases in depth, but today we'll be focusing on a couple of key points within configure and protect. So really, we should start with configuration profiles. So Intune includes settings and features that you can enable and configure or disable for different devices within your organization. And these settings and features are added to what Intune calls configuration profiles. You can create profiles for different devices and different platforms, including iOS, iPadOS, Android, Windows, and macOS. Then using Intune, you can apply or the correct term in Intune is assign the profile to users and devices. This is typically where you'll do the bulk of your unified endpoint configuration. It can often take time to design and configure your configuration profiles. There's a raft of configuration options within Intune that you can select and configure. And a lot of time organizations like to adhere to certain security frameworks like CIS or NIST or NCSC, and picking through each of the settings in those profiles can be quite a time-consuming task. There is a tool actually that can help speed this up. I'm going to demo that in just a moment, so that will hopefully be able to save you some time here if you're looking to build out a configuration profile baseline. So what do they provide, configuration profiles? Well, they give us the ability to configure device features, device restrictions, access configurations, or other custom settings that may not necessarily be presented through the Intune GUI. Those custom settings, I liken them more to group policy style settings. So we can affect more change than is actually available to us in the Intune GUI through the use of those settings. And in fact, we actually have the ability now within Intune to import custom ADMX files, for instance, that go above and beyond the pre-canned functionality in the service itself. So you really do now have very granular control over what you can apply in a configuration profile. Now, as I just touched on, these profiles would typically be aligned to a security framework, such as CIS, NIST, or NCSC, and we tend to try and apply these profiles across all device types in your estate. Now, Cocho are a CIS Secure Suite member. We work across all the security frameworks, as you can imagine, but I have a demo shortly which will include the NCSC policies. They have a nice GitHub repo where you can actually grab those policies as JSON format and import them very quickly into your estate. So I'm going to show you a bit of that in just a moment. It's a real time saver there. So when we talk about delivering a configuration profile, it's really important to understand how profiles are deployed through Intune. Device connectivity can change, as you can imagine. We've got remote users. We're not sure what internet connection they may be on. They may be moving around throughout the day, going through periods of being offline. So depending on the scenario at play and the connectivity of the device that's talking back to Intune, there are a few kind of scenarios that you need to consider for that profile delivery. So when a device is online, it phones home around every 8 hours. This is a standard check-in to ensure that the device has the correct policy assignment. So if there are any major deltas in that assignment at that point in time, that is tidied up and squared away. So if a device is offline, it will check in the next time it comes online at that scheduled interval. So if it has to wait up for that roughly 8 hours, it will do. But the difference really then is around when changes are made to a policy. Now, changes such as a policy removal or a change, they're actually deployed via a push from Intune. So once that setting's changed and something new arrives, this is usually deployed instantaneously to a device. It can sometimes take up to a few hours, but those cases are fairly rare, and in fact, changes usually come down pretty quickly. So if that's the case and the device is offline and changes have been made, Intune will try to notify the device up to 4 times. If the device is not online during that period, the policy will be updated on the next check-in. Another key aspect to securing your endpoints with Intune is compliance. So you can create and deploy compliance policies in Intune to ensure your endpoints meet criteria set out by your organization. So this is quite useful. It can be used in turn to influence conditional access, perhaps limiting or blocking access to corporate resources if we deem the endpoint not compliant. There's a number of elements actually that you can key on for device compliance. Some of those might be something like requiring a minimum operating system version, the use of a password or PIN that meets a certain complexity and length, or perhaps a device being at or below a threat level as determined by mobile threat defense. So that might be something like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on a mobile or Windows device. But actually Intune also supports other partners in the MTD space as well. But that's quite a useful tool to be able to drive compliance for devices that have significant security threats. And sometimes a compliance policy may conflict with a setting in a configuration profile. So this slide outlines the order of precedence that will take place. So it's really important to remember that compliance policies, they also affect change on an endpoint. So if you have a compliance policy, for instance, that requires an 8-digit PIN, but you also have a configuration profile that requires a 6-digit PIN, the compliance policy will win out because it will have a more restrictive setting being an 8-digit PIN. So that compliance policy will actually make that change on the device, much like a configuration profile would. So really important to understand that process flow. Generally speaking, it's most restrictive wins. The main difference really here is if there are policy conflicts across 2 configuration profiles. The conflict has to be manually resolved in the Intune portal. So it's a very straightforward go in, compare the 2, remove the setting from one. And much like pretty much all other settings and policies really within Intune, they can be assigned to users or devices through the use of assignment rules. So assignment rules really help provide a granular approach to scoping. They help really ensure that you target the right people and the right devices, and that everyone's getting the right settings. In most cases, especially when we look at the security configurations, we try to ensure that we target all users. Now we do this really so that we minimize the risk of human error, and we take away that need for an admin to constantly manage a group of users or devices. So this becomes slightly more complex when users have more than one device, and you may not want the policy to apply to all of those devices. And there's a feature coming up, which I'll show you on the next slide, which really helps there. An alternative approach to assignment rules is to use Azure AD security groups with dynamic query, though I think filters, which will come into play on the next slide, really kind of fill that gap for us. So filters, as I mentioned, are a relatively new feature to Intune. So what they do is they help admins scope devices in or out of a policy assignment. So for this, I always use the example of a configuration policy that applies to all users. So it may be our kind of core security policy that we want all user endpoints, traditional endpoints, to receive. So the policy is designed for endpoints, but we also have an Azure Virtual Desktop instance in play in this case, providing a VDI session to that user. Now, in my example, that AVD instance is managed separately, so we don't want that configuration profile inadvertently applying to that VDI session. By default, it would, because that configuration profile follows the user, being a member of all users. So we can actually use a filter in this case to evaluate a list of all devices, let's say with a host name starting with VDI- or AVD-, something that we can key on, some unique aspect of your VDI estate. So in my pretend case here, all of our host names for VDI for AVD start with AVD-. So that filter returns all of those sessions. The result is that configuration profile will apply to the user on every device except for the ones that match that filter expression. So this makes targeting devices or excluding devices much more straightforward. It's really useful in scenarios where you need complete control over device targeting. You can see the example on the screen there is around excluding personal devices. You can also flip that evaluation on its head and say, actually, we want it to apply only to personal devices. So it's really granular, and there are some supported device properties that are listed in the top right of that slide. So you can pretty much key on any of those pieces of metadata there. So yeah, you can really start to get quite granular with your assignment policies there. And then hopefully you all caught the release news of endpoint privilege management recently. So this is another investment area for Microsoft that looks to bring in native capability for privilege escalation. So EPM lets your users run as a standard user account without administrator rights and complete tasks that require elevated privileges, all without the need for having an admin password. So tasks that commonly require admin privileges are things like application installs. We have updating device drivers, potentially running certain Windows diagnostics. Endpoint privilege management aims to fill that gap, really, and it helps support your zero trust journey by helping your organization achieve a broad user base running with least privilege, while allowing users to still run the tasks that we permit. And it's very granular, the configuration actually in EPM. I'm going to take you through that in just a moment. So if you bear with me, I am going to bring up my demo and we'll take a look at some of those topics in the real world. So hopefully you should all see my screen just now, and you'll see that I'm in a Microsoft Intune Admin Center portal. So this is a demo portal that I use. You'll see that there's one Windows device enrolled into this tenant, which is this device here, owned by a Mr. Alex Wilbur. He's currently logged on. It's fully enrolled into Intune. And we are going to take a look at what endpoint privilege management looks like on this device. So before we go through the user workflow, Let's jump into endpoint security over here. And then you should see in your tenant now, as it's GA, an endpoint privilege management blade. So I'm going to click in there just for now. And there's really two kind of key aspects or two types of policy that you need to consider deploying for EPM or to enable EPM. And those are settings and rules. So let's start with settings. This is very, very straightforward. This will allow you to turn on the EPM client on the endpoint. So as you can imagine, there's not a huge amount of settings we need to configure here. But what this does do is it tells Windows to turn on the client for EPM. And you can see here I have that set to enabled. I also have elevation data for reporting because, you know, elevating applications in this demo context is all well and good, but we need to be able to audit that as well. So that's pushed out to my test device. And then if I jump into the EPM rules policy, this is where we start to then define what we want to allow users to elevate. So you can see here that this policy is scoped to all users again. And if we have a look at the configuration settings, you'll see that I have an application here. This is the installer for VS Code, by the way. So you can see here that I have this set to user confirmed. So that means that the user has to click something in order to elevate this application. It can also be zero touch, so it's just silently treated as allowed. And with the user confirmed elevation type, we can also ask for a business justification. This is a kind of free form text box where the user can type a message. That message also gets recorded into the reports, and I'll show you that in just a moment as well. At the moment, we don't have admin approvals, though I suspect that may be something that comes later on down the line. So this is very much just a recording of the user's justification. And then we have a couple of options around how we tell the device what we're allowing them to use. So in this case, we've got an installer. It's an executable file we want to allow. Now we can give the EPM policy the file name, which will just be VS Code and whatever else .exe. We can give it the file hash, or we can give it a publisher certificate or a self-signed certificate. You can actually use most of these in conjunction as well. So most of the time you wouldn't tend to use just a file name. File names can change very easily. So, you know, simply renaming an executable to a sort of an EPM known name would bypass that functionality. So really you want to try to aim for using publisher certificates or file hash. Grabbing a file hash is very, very straightforward. I mean, it's a case of just running get dash file hash. You can see here I've already run it. Let's run it again, and it'll give us that file hash there. And you can apply that instead of the certificate here, and I'll show you that in just a mo. You also have this option here for child process behavior. So when we elevate an installation, for instance, and it goes off and spawns a child process, how do we want that to be handled? Do we just want those child processes just to run as elevated, or do we want to prompt for more justification or even block? But for this instance, I know that the installer does copy over to the temp folder and run some additional installs there. So I'm keeping that one as allow to run elevated. And you can see I also specify the file name here. That's important. I'll show you the difference in how that looks in just a moment. So let's jump on to the test box. And let me minimize this here. By the way, supplying the publisher certificate, if you don't know how that's done, again, that's quite straightforward. Here's the VS Code setup. We can click on properties. We can hit digital signatures here. We can look at the certificate. And then we simply copy that certificate to a file. And we just want to make sure that we select base64, a CER file. And then that can be uploaded directly to Intune. You can see I've exported it there already. So back to our downloads folder. So I'm a user that perhaps has just downloaded this tool after receiving a new device. I want to be able to install it. Let's see what happens if we try to run it just as a standard user. As you'd expect, we'll get a UAC prompt, and that'll ask for some admin credentials. Eventually, there we go. So of course I don't have an admin account for this device, so that's useless to me. So if we right click again, we'll see that we now have run with elevated access because we've turned EPM on this device. So if I hit run with elevated access, we'll get a nice new screen that should prompt us for some business justification. Here we go. So I might say, I need to do some web dev. And then I can click continue. That gets filed away and audited in our tenant, and the installer will launch. So really straightforward setup. And as you can see, very straightforward from a user standpoint. Now I mentioned before that I also specified the file name in my VS Code profile. So if I try to run this is the default name, by the way, when you download VS Code for a system context install. But if I run that with elevated access, you'll see that this one's rejected because although it has the same publisher cert, it doesn't have the same file name. So, that just really goes to show how you can combine those attributes to be more secure. So I'm going to cancel that just for now. I'm going to show you what that looks like back in the EPM portal in Intune. So if I head on over to reports here and elevation report, I can see I've got my elevations here. I can see where they've spawned child processes. They're classed as the zero touch ones here. You can see they've been copies to the app data from the installer. But the one that we'd be interested in would be the user confirmed. It's this one here. You can see the path where I ran that from. If I click the link, I can see my justification there as well. So just a nice kind of reporting add-on that we have there just to be able to record those elevations when needed. So really useful if you haven't tried this out or you use another third-party product to provide some of this functionality. It's definitely worth exploring. You can test it in your tenant. I believe with a single license, it is an add-on. So there is an additional cost to EPM either through the Intune suite or through a standalone add-in. But absolutely have a look at what you're using today because, in a lot of cases, this is much more cost effective in terms of kind of native capability. So one of the other elements I also touched on was security baselines. So if I go back to endpoint security here, hopefully some of you at least will already be aware of this functionality. It's been around a little while. But if we have a look at security baselines here, now these are kind of pre-canned out of the box Microsoft developed baselines for Windows 10 and above, Defender for Endpoint, Edge, Windows 365, and Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise. So, your office productivity apps. And these provide a really great kind of baseline for default security. So if you're starting an Intune journey today and you don't have a defined or a well-defined framework or security policy, this is a really great way to get started very, very quickly. Now, they do contain the vast majority of settings that overlap with, typical CIS or NIST kind of settings. And if you apply a security baseline to an endpoint and then have a look at that through Defender for Endpoint device security score, you actually do score up in the early 80s in terms of percentage. So it's a very, very secure profile whilst not being too restrictive. But they're, very straightforward to apply. We can just create a test one here. One thing to mention is they're not updated as frequently as kind of vendor frameworks like CIS. So that's definitely something to consider. That being said, they still provide that, kind of really kind of baseline level for you to start working with. And then we jump straight onto configuration settings where we can see all the settings that are applied within this profile. So if you haven't looked at this before, definitely recommend taking a look and seeing how well this marries up to your own expectations. Again, you can come in here and tweak these for your organization and deploy them through the standard assignment approach. So great for organizations that are just starting out. Now, one caveat with security baselines is that when you remove a baseline, not all settings are immediately returned to their original value. Kind of like group policy, when you set something, then switch it to not configured, it wouldn't necessarily affect the change back to what it was originally. So that's something to consider. That being said, you can still override those settings with configuration profiles. So you do have a workaround there if need be. But I tend to, for most organizations, spend most of my time talking around those configuration profiles. So if I jump into there very quickly, you'll see when I click create profile here that we have a number of settings that we can pick through, and this is where some of that effort, that design and deployment effort really sits, because the catalog is pretty huge, to be honest. I'm just going to go into settings catalog just very briefly for Windows 10 and above, just to give you a flavor of what those settings look like. So we can click into the settings explorer here, and in a moment when that loads, we have the settings picker. So this is really similar to typical GPMC type tool, group policy management. You can click through, select the settings that you want to apply, and then you specify those in the bottom. Fortunately, you do have the ability to search at the top. So if you're looking for specific settings, you can pull those out, configure them here, and apply those settings. Like I say, this is often quite a time-consuming activity, especially if you're trying to translate vendor frameworks like CIS, security frameworks, into configuration profiles. But there is an easier way. So if I go back to configuration profiles here, you can see I have 2 demo profiles. Now, I mentioned earlier on actually that NCSC provide a really nice framework for all device types actually. And the nice thing is, under their device security guidance on their website, and again I'll share the link to this site, we actually have a GitHub repo that we can explore, which contains the JSON files for all of the settings in their framework. So if we have a look here, you can see we've got Apple, Google, Ubuntu, and Windows. So obviously we're looking at Windows. Let's click here. They offer those framework settings as group policy objects or MDM configurations, which is what we're looking at. So I'm going to click here, and you can see we have all of their policies defined within these JSON files. So let's say, now typically you'd probably take all of these, but I'm going to pick one here. Let's do app blocker, because it will pop up first, being A, when I download it. So you can see the JSON definition here. If we just download that file very quickly, and I'll just show you, I already have it, of course. Let me grab and paste it in here. So you can see I have a couple of, actually a couple I've downloaded already as well. So let's use this app blocker. So there's a PowerShell script that can be freely downloaded from the Microsoft Graph Samples GitHub as well, called device configuration import from JSON. And it's simply a case of running the script with the JSON file parameter at the end. It will prompt you for an email and password, which I've already supplied this morning on my run through. And you can see pretty much immediately that's run through. So now if I jump back into my configurations profiles, refresh the page, you can see I now have my Windows 10 and later configuration profile for app blocker as defined by NCSC, ready to roll. So really useful tool. Great that they're being published in the public domain like that, because it makes all of our lives that much easier to secure our endpoints. Just one thing to note on this, they're created without an assignment. So no changes will happen just by applying these. Essentially, you just come in here and then add the assignment that you want to all users, a group of users, however you want to deploy that. So very minimal risk of those going out unexpectedly, let's say. And that concludes the demo and the webinar, actually. So thank you very much for your time today. If you want to talk to us some more, probably the best bet would be to look to book a vision call with one of our experts. So we can have a chat with you about your own requirements, the art of the possible within your organization, what's keeping you up, keeping you awake at night. And let's help you begin that journey to greatness. So if that sounds like it might be of interest, please do let us know. Conscious of time, I have overrun a little bit as I normally do. So I'll leave you with this slide up for now. If there are any questions, if you please could drop them into the Q&A box in the GoToWebinar screen. I'll make sure to take those away with me and get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your time today, everyone. See you soon.